Tonight, on the John Ankerberg Show, the topic is Seventh-day Adventism at the Crossroads. Many people know the Adventists as the people who go to church on Saturday. Others know them as the people who don't eat meat. And they are perhaps best known for their outstanding hospitals and clinics. But the Seventh-day Adventist Church is in turmoil and stands at the most critical crossroads in its history. Which way will this great church go? Those invited to speak for it but declined the invitation were Dr. Neil Wilson, President, General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists; Dr. Robert Olson, Chairman, the E.G.White Estate; Dr. Victor Cooper, Associate Director, General Conference of SDA; Mr. Warren Johns, Associate Editor, Ministry Magazine; and Dr. William Johnson, Associate Editor, Adventist Review. To help us uncover the answers, John will interview two of the leading spokesmen in the Adventist Church. They'll discuss issues of biblical authority, the writings of E.G.White, and recent charges of the church's misuse of funds. John's first guest is the widely respected Adventist theologian, author, and pastor, Dr. Desmond Ford. Dr. Ford received his Ph.D. from Manchester University, England, and has served as a theology professor at several Adventist seminaries and colleges. He is the author of 9 books and many articles published in Adventist journals, and has sat on the highest doctrinal body of the church, the Biblical Research Institute. Reverend Walter Rea is John's second guest. He is a scholar, author, and pastor. Reverend Rea is recognized as the leading authority on the writings of E.G.White and has written more concerning her works than any other person. Now, let's join John and his guests to examine Seventh-day Adventism at the Crossroads.
We're glad that you're here, and gentlemen on the platform tonight, you are written up in Time magazine as we do this show, and Walter Rea, they say about you in Time magazine, Ford's challenge was mild compared with a bombshell dropped by Walter T. Rea of Patterson, California, a veteran pastor. Rea, in the course of Ph.D. research, stumbled across some long-buried writings by forgotten divines that matched huge swatches of Prophet White's books. And it goes on to say, Rea was the first to document the vast scale of borrowing from 75 assorted books on history, doctrine, and the Bible. And last April, Rea issued his full findings in a book titled The White Lie. You're holding The White Lie in your hand. Sure. For people that don't know who E.G.White is, tell us, who was E.G.White?
Well, of course, I had no Adventist background, John. I came into the church, I was a Christian before I was an Adventist, but I was not denominationally oriented. So when I became an Adventist, I became acquainted with Mrs. White, which is the Seventh-day Adventist prophet. And I was always a devotee of Mrs. White, began to read. She fascinated me. She covered all the doctrines from Genesis to Revelation, and our Christology and eschatology, mainly our main points of doctrine. And I had spent probably 25 years of my lifetime devoted to her study. I had written 3 books, Bible biographies, Old and New Testament, in which I had accumulated all of the published and unpublished works of Mrs. White and sent it out to the Bible houses of the Adventists. They were used in all of our schools, universities. Also the book of Daniel and Revelation, all of her statements I could find, I had sent that out, but not commented on them, merely because I felt that they were something special that had been given by divine revelation. Some critics have said I believed in verbal inspiration. I really don't believe that's correct. I did believe they had authority, and much more authority than anyone else that had written.
Des, would it be fair to say that the man sitting next to you has published more on E.G.White than anybody else?
Walter Rea has done more research on the origin of the E.G.White writings than any person that's ever lived. So we're taking in not only contemporary Adventists, but the Adventists over a century. That is certain.
And you loved her, believed in her, knew her writings, published them.
I think anyone who does that, John, is known in Adventism as a conservative. That is, they really are a true believer. And I think it's fair to say I was a true believer.
Okay, and as you had these large pastorates in different places, people gave you books. Well, what happened?
The first book that came to my attention was while I was in Florida from one of our eminent doctors, Dr. Kress, and gave me the book Sketches from the Life of Paul. It was written by Coney Barrenhausen, and I naively started to read it, and one of the members, who was an older member, knowledgeable, said, well, that's the book that the Adventists would rather forget, because Mrs. White's Life of Paul, or Sketches from the Life of Paul, was largely taken from that material. So I did a study and found that the criticism was correct, that there were similarities.
What did you think when you saw that?
I was shocked because we had been taught. You have to understand what you're taught in Adventism, at least in our generation.
Okay, what were you taught?
We were taught that Mrs. White was not influenced by outside sources. And while I never thought that through at the time, it sounded logical. So that was one thing that bothered me.
Where did you think that she got this?
Well, she got it directly from God, by revelation or inspiration, without outside influence. The second is, in most of Mrs. White's counsels, she counseled against all of our ministers using outside sources. So as a theologian, I found it very difficult to get my degrees without reading all of this, quote, so-called trash in the outside world. And we weren't supposed to use this. And so it was shocking to find from the standpoint, wait a minute, she was using what she condemned and said we shouldn't use it.
So your curiosity was at least awakened.
It was at least awakened, and I began to correspond with the White Estate, which is the official organization for handling the doctrines of E.G.White. And I expressed some of my concern, and they said, well, these are not new concerns, and they pointed out that some had found this before.
Then what?
Then I moved to California, and someone else gave me another book on Edersheim, his Old and New Testament. I found that he was a converted Jew. He'd written on the life of Christ. Lo and behold, I found that some of the format for patriarchs and prophets written by E.G.White had the same titles. I put them in the book. And also that some of the statements were taken directly from Edersheim. And this was devastating. In fact, I used to say facetiously, at that time the guilt was overwhelming, and I used to do the study under the bed with the lights out because I was, really nervous. But I notified the White Estate, and they wrote back and encouraged me in the study, and I kept the letters saying, keep us informed. Although this is not new, we're interested in some of these angles. Well, I went to a public meeting, and there some member of the White Estate denied that there was any borrowing in the book Desire of Ages. By that time, I had found a book by Hannah, which is an English writer, on the life of Christ. And this was the most shocking of all.
Why?
Well, it was shocking because chapter after chapter she was plagiarizing or taking whole sections of that book and paraphrasing it. So when a person says you can't find 3 or 4 sentences that she copied, this is deceitful. It wasn't the sentences that she wanted to copy.
So the White Estate was saying that there was no borrowing, and here you had all the books showing that it was.
This is true.
So what'd you do?
Well, then we asked for a meeting. We asked for a meeting with the scholars of the church, and in January of '80, with picking and choosing, we were allowed to sit before 18 scholars. And after 2 days, those 18 scholars voted 6 motions. One was that the borrowing was more extensive than they had believed, that it was really shocking. Second is that it should be brought to the attention of the church immediately in seminars and study groups. Third, I should be given scholarly help to work it out into a printed form. They had discouraged me from publishing anything. And that's important because when I went before the committee, I didn't have anything published. They said, you should have this published. And I said, well, you forbade it, and don't think that you'll be the only ones that'll read it if I go to the trouble of publishing it. So I hadn't published. So they said, well, we'll help you get it in this form. And then they gave me a vote of thanks. Well, we were elated because we felt that this was a problem that had long been overdue, had been discussed in scholarly circles. I will grant that scholars do have some benefits. But nonetheless, the church as a whole had not known this. And it is erroneous to say that the church has always known this. if they have always known it, why was I fired, and why did they meet with me, and why was the committee upset, and why did they vote? So they didn't. Well, within about 60 days, the President's Advisory Committee of the General Conference wrote a letter, which I put a copy, I think, in the book, and said, forget it, we'll take it from here, we'll notify the people what we think they should know, and you go back to your work as a pastor.
And then what'd you do?
Well, I wrote them a letter and said, well, evidently the church has decided that I should not be the one. They felt that I was too harsh in my judgments and perhaps too negative in my approach or conclusion. So I said the church has spoken. I had a decision whether I wanted to stay with the system or get out. And I wanted to stay with the system and work within it. My purpose was to lower the voice in the church and the administration on E.G.White and to put Jesus Christ back in the center of the church where I felt it really was belong. And I felt that Mrs. White, from my study and research, had been a deterrent. She was the one that endorsed the 2,300 days that Des talks about. She was the one that endorsed all the doctrines we held officially. And therefore, no one was allowed to go beyond the thinking and the endorsement of E.G.White and plow new ground. So I merely wanted to lower. And my premise was the 5 books that Adventists count on, the conflict series from Genesis to Revelation, were thus came by human means rather than divine revelation. This they didn't want to accept.
Walter, you have touched on the writings of E.G.White. You have published more than anybody else. You've done more research in this area than anybody else. In terms of, do you use the word plagiarism?
I do, they don't.
Define it for us. What is plagiarism?
The first time I was acquainted with the word was when John Dart from the Los Angeles Times